Good morning, everybody. It's so great to have you with us. My name is Johann. I'm one of the pastors here at the Family Worship Center. And if this is your first time joining us, I just want to say welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. We're just so glad that you chose to be with us this morning, or if you're watching this later, thank you for joining us. Just a couple things before we dive into our talk and our new series today. Next week, Pastor Dallas will be talking about making time for your spouse. And so be sure to tune in next week again as he unpacks what that looks like for us. And as these next 4 weeks, as we look at the topic of marriage and how we can thrive in our marriage and really in all of our relationships. Also, I want to let you know that if you have a question today at any point, please send us a private message or send me an email. My email's on the screen. We would love to hear from you. I'm really glad that you chose to be on this journey with us. And while I might not have all the answers for you, I would love to make this a conversation as we wrestle with some of these really important issues regarding marriage and relationships. I want to start today's talk by saying that I know we have people joining us today who are in a variety of different circumstances. Some of you are single, some of you are married, some of you are, maybe divorced or in between marriages. Wherever you find yourself at today, I'm glad that you're here with us. If there's one thing I know about marriage, it's that it's messy. Why? Well, for one thing, because I'm married. But I also know because people are messy. I'm messy. You're messy. And when two messy people come together, there are going to be challenges. That's just what happens when two people come together and make vows to one another and then step into the real world and are faced with real challenges. Marriage issues are very complex, and we only have a limited time together today, so I know we'll just be scratching the surface, but I'm hoping that what we talk about today gives you a bit of insight, and maybe you'll have a couple of aha moments throughout our time together. I know there are going to be scenarios that you'll think of in your head about your own marriage, or maybe some friends of yours, or maybe your kids' marriage, and you're probably going to say, yeah, but what about this situation? And let me just say right now that I'm going to make some generalizations today, and I know that there are always exceptions to the rule. I'm aware of that, but I hope that we can learn together on some of these issues. And if you have a question, you can send me an email. I would love to hear from you. The thing about marriage is that you can have two people who are committed to each other, they love each other, they want to get along, they both have good intentions, but they still run into challenges with conflict. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm not talking about situations where there's abuse or unfaithfulness in the marriage. What I'll be talking about today is situations where two good-willed people who are committed to one another and who want to have a good marriage and are doing everything that they can, but they just can't seem to get out of patterns of conflict that are draining and unproductive and frustrating. So that's what I'm going to be covering today. Marriage can either be the best thing ever or the worst thing ever. It all depends on how it's going. What I mean by that is when it's good, when things are going well and it's like you're clicking with your spouse, you understand each other, in those kind of times, it's awesome. And, it's just the most incredible thing. But, when things aren't going well, it can be quite difficult. Conflict is a normal part of any marriage, and when it's dealt with in the right way, it's perfectly healthy. But I do believe that sometimes we get caught in these unhealthy kind of patterns of conflict, these unhealthy cycles, where both spouses are unhappy with each other, and every time, one of you tries to fix it, it just seems to get worse. So today I'm hoping that we can gain a little bit of insight as to why this happens and how to prevent these unproductive cycles of conflict that can lead to a lot of unnecessary difficulty and pain. Well, no marriage is perfect. I'm not sitting here telling you from a place where I have it all figured out, because I don't. So regardless of where you feel you're at in your marriage today, there's no judgment here. Some of you have a really good marriage, and I hope that some of these things that we talk about today are helpful to make your marriage even better. For some of you, if you're honest with yourself, maybe you're really struggling and you might even need a miracle in your marriage. And while I can't promise that we can save your marriage, we'll pray together at the end of our time together, and we'd love to be able to continue the conversation if you need ongoing help. You know, with COVID and everything that has come with it, some of you might be spending more time together as a couple and as a family than ever before. Or on the flip side of that, you might be spending a lot less time together because your spouse is working maybe a lot more hours than they were before, or with being unable to see certain family members or family members from other households, you might be spending less time together. But whichever situation you find yourself in your marriage, you might find that things are just a little bit more tense than usual between you and your spouse. And I just want to assure you that that is very normal. Our circumstances and outside pressures can put strain on our relationships, and you might find that you are more prone to these patterns of conflict than usual. Today we're going to look at a couple of sections in the Bible to learn a bit about what it has to say about marriage relationships. And there are many reasons why we look at the Bible, and the reasons why the Bible is such a helpful resource, but a big reason why we're looking at the Bible is because when it's read, understood correctly, and applied to our lives, it can change our lives for the better, including our marriages. On the flip side of that is when it's understood incorrectly, the Bible can cause confusion, division, and pain. And maybe you've experienced this in your life before, or in the life of a loved one, and you've thought, you know what, the Bible just isn't working for me. And I understand that. And this is why it's so important that we study the Bible carefully, so that we can actually really know what it's actually saying, and to be able to apply that to our lives instead of causing confusion and pain. On the topic of marriage, I think the Apostle Paul said it best when he wrote this in chapter 7 of his first letter to the Corinthians. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "Those who marry will face many troubles in this life." So in other words, Paul says you will face challenges, trouble, struggles in this life if you get married. Now, does that mean you won't face challenges if you stay single? No, of course not. But there are challenges that are unique to marriage, and that is what Paul is talking about here. And in his letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul explains that Jesus has opened up a new way of living for us, a new way to relate to God and to one another, that we have become children of God by believing in Jesus. And in his letter, he takes a moment to focus on marriage and how specifically this impacts the way we live out our marriages. And what's important to remember about this passage is that Paul was writing to a specific group of people in a specific place at a specific time in history. And we'll talk a little bit more about these details in just a moment. But in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33, he writes these words that are actually quite profound, especially given the audience that he was writing to. And this is what he writes. It says, "Each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." He explains that husbands should love their wives in the same way that Jesus showed his love for his people, the church. And the way that Jesus did this was to give himself up for his church. He died for his church. Now, unfortunately, there have been people, particularly men, who throughout the history of the church have used these kinds of sections of Paul's letters to demand respect from women, and that has never gone well. The idea here is not that wives should demand love from their husbands and that husbands should demand respect from their wives, but rather that they both give each other love and respect unconditionally. I mentioned earlier that Paul was writing this to a specific group of people during a specific time in history. And it's important for us to remember that in this culture, men were ranked higher than women in the social hierarchy. And unfortunately, that often resulted in the poor treatment of women and disrespect of women. So the instructions that Paul is giving the Ephesians in this passage is radically different from what their culture was telling them. The idea that a man would love his wife so deeply and completely was totally countercultural for that time. And that's one of the things I love about the good news of Jesus. His message is that everyone is worthy of love and respect, regardless of gender, race, or cultural background. And thankfully, this letter to the Ephesians was not only written by Paul to a specific group of people, but it also holds a timeless truth for us reading it today as well. And so we too should give and receive mutual love and respect to our spouse. But what happens when you're genuinely trying to do that, but you feel like your best efforts with your spouse aren't received the way you hoped and you're left spinning around in circles? Why is it that two people who love each other and do their best to make things work still end up driving each other crazy? The reason is because they're trying to communicate to each other while speaking two different languages. We read in the passage earlier that we're meant to give and receive mutual love and respect to our spouse. In Dr. Emerson Eggerich's book, Love and Respect, he proposes that men and women actually have different primary needs in a relationship, and these needs shape the way that they interact with one another. If you haven't read this book, Love and Respect, I highly recommend it as a great resource for marriage. It's helped me a lot in my understanding, and so I definitely recommend that book. And if you read it, I'd love to hear what you thought of it, so please send me an email and let's chat, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. In this book, Dr. Eggerich says that a man's primary need in the relationship is to feel respected by his wife, and a woman's primary need in the relationship is to feel loved by her husband. Now, there are a lot of different factors that come into play, like the culture that you were raised in and different personality types, for example, and all of these things can play into this, but generally speaking, the husband's primary need is to be respected, and the wife's primary need is to be loved. That means that the husband and the wife are coming from two different perspectives in the relationship. We could even say, in a sense, that they're speaking two different languages. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that women don't need respect and men don't need love. Of course they need both. What I'm saying, and what many psychologists have discovered, is that men and women experience relationships very different, and their primary needs are different. And when these needs aren't met, trouble ensues. For example, I recently read a story about a couple that was about to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. The wife wasn't sure if the husband would remember because there had been plenty of times when he hadn't remembered. No matter what kind of hints she would drop, he just would not pick up on it at all. But on their 10th wedding anniversary, he finally remembers. So he goes to Hallmark and he starts looking at all those cards, and there's one card that just pops out at him. He just knows this is the right one. So he looks at it. It's really colorful. It looks nice. He skims the words. He's like, this is the card. This is the perfect one. And so he pays for it and he heads home feeling really happy and even a little bit proud of himself because he finally remembered this year. He's got a card. He's got a gift, all these things. And so he gets home and he hides the card from his wife, sneaks it in, goes into a room, quickly signs his name on the card, puts it in the envelope. He puts her name on the envelope, and he even adds a couple of little hearts on it just to, kind of add it as a nice touch. And he's feeling great about this, and so he gives the card to his wife, and she's so happy that her husband remembered this year, and she is all smiles. She is just beaming. She tears open the envelope and starts reading the card, and then her smile disappears. Her expression starts to grow dark and cold. He's a sensitive guy, so he can tell when something is wrong. So he asks her, "What's wrong?" She quickly says, "Nothing." But he can tell something's not right. So he asks again, "No, what is it?" And she says again, No, nothing's wrong. "But there is, I can tell. What is it?" Finally, she says to him, "Well, it's not bad for a birthday card." You can see where this is going. The husband says, "No way, you've got to be kidding. That's unbelievable." She says, "No, you're unbelievable." The husband starts to get a little bit defensive now. He had done his best. He had remembered. He bought a card and a gift for her this year. So he says to her, "Honey, it was an honest mistake. Give me a break." The problem is that, this is the way she responds. She says, "The problem is that you just don't care." Right? If you were to take your car in to be detailed and they put a stripe on the side, if it was even just the tiniest bit off, you would notice because you care about it. But you don't care about our anniversary. You don't care about me. And at this point, the husband goes from feeling guilty to feeling a little bit angry. And he says, "Hey, it was an honest mistake." And she says, "Well, wow, you buy me a birthday card on our 10th anniversary? I'd rather you hadn't bought me any card at all." This just makes him even more angry because he did his best to do the loving thing, and she just keeps attacking him. So he finally says, "You know what? With the way you're talking, I'm glad that I got you a birthday card for your anniversary." With that, he slams the door and goes to the opposite end of the house. Here, a night that was supposed to be a fun evening together turned out to be a disaster. And they're both sitting at opposite ends of the house thinking, this is absolutely crazy. This story is also from that book, Love and Respect, and it's based on a real story about a couple. And the story is just a great example of something that happens very often in relationships. It is the crazy cycle of conflict. The author explains that we can get on the crazy cycle where the husband appears careless, and that makes the wife feel unloved. And so then she reacts with pretty harsh criticism and complaints about him, which tends to make him feel disrespected. So this cycle just goes around and around until eventually it can lead to much larger issues and even divorce. And the thing is, it doesn't matter how much the couple loves each other and wants to get along. This is a cycle that any couple can get caught in. We all have these moments of intense fellowship. I know I've had my share with my wife Emma as well. There's these. I have a habit of leaving my books and leaving things out. Just I'll leave a book out here and something out there and one of the things that I do sometimes is I'll leave my clothes, like my shirt, on a chair somewhere, or leave it on the floor or something like that. And we can get into these cycles where I've left something out and I didn't mean to, like I'm trying to get better, but I leave something out and then Emma notices, and before you know it, we're kind of in a cycle of conflict. And this can happen to anybody. And the worst part about the crazy cycle is that it keeps us from being really honest with our spouse and dealing with real issues in our relationship. The crazy cycle stunts the growth of marriage and sabotages our best efforts to connect with our spouse. So having said all of this, I want to share 4 practical tips today with you that will help to guide us away from the crazy cycle so that we can connect with our spouses in meaningful ways and our marriages can grow stronger and healthier. Tip number 1 is to assume the best of your spouse. A lot of conflicts in our marriages can be resolved or even completely avoided if we choose to assume the best of our spouse. In that story I shared earlier, the wife knew that her husband had forgotten their anniversary before, so she wasn't exactly expecting him to knock it out of the park for their 10th anniversary. And so when he presented her with a very carefully selected birthday card, she was ready to feel disappointed and upset. She instantly believed the worst in him, assuming that he had carelessly grabbed the wrong card because he didn't really care about their anniversary or that he even loved her at all. Perhaps you've been in a situation where you've assumed the worst about your spouse, or your spouse has believed the worst about you. I know Emma and I have been there many times. Emma has a saying that I always like to tease her about. She likes to say, "People are human." And I always kind of laugh and say, well, yes, of course. But she's got a point. We're imperfect human beings, and we marry imperfect human beings. So the question is not if we're going to feel moments of disappointment in our marriage and disappointment in our spouse, but when and how we're going to react. Will we assume the worst in our spouse, letting our minds run to the worst possible places, or will we believe the best in them and break that cycle, that crazy cycle of conflict? Tip number 2 is to consider the timing. Timing is important. For example, if all of a sudden you remember an issue that you've been wanting to discuss with your spouse, but it's 11 a.m. or 11 p.m., it's late at night, you've just both had a really long day, maybe that's not the best time to talk about that issue. I remember one time when Emma and myself, when we were dating, we got into a pretty big argument in the car when we were about to say goodnight, and I was about to drop her off at her house, and somehow we got into an argument, and I don't even remember what it was about, but all I remember is that after a good 45 minutes or so of arguing and going back and forth, we just could not get to the bottom of this issue. And so we were stuck in this crazy cycle of conflict, and we finally decided we just weren't going to get it resolved. And so we had to let it go and to work on it again the following day. And as a Christian, I'd always heard, don't let the sun go down on your anger. And so I used to think that meant I could not go to bed without having resolved that conflict. But Emma and I have found that sometimes it's just too late and both of us are just simply too tired to work out the issue properly. And the best thing sometimes for us is just to go to bed and deal with it another time. This is something that Emma and I are still figuring out in our marriage, and I encourage you in your marriage to figure out what times work best for you to discuss these kinds of important topics with your spouse and learn when to have those tough conversations. Tip number 3 is to resist the urge for payback. This is pretty simple. What happens when 2 kids are playing in the sandbox and one of them decides to hit the other one? Well, they get hit back. And they'll just go back and forth until one of them decides to stop. And we have this natural urge when we feel we've been hurt or wronged to get back at that person. We all have that urge inside of us. But again, Paul has something to say about that in his letter to the Romans. He said, never pay back evil with more evil. Paul's pretty clear about this. Never pay back evil with more evil. Not just sometimes, not just when we're having a good day or when we're feeling extra gracious, but he says never. Paul knows that when we resist the urge to fight back and instead choose to give unconditional love, unconditional respect to our spouse, that breaks that crazy cycle of conflict. So then the key becomes learning to identify when you're entering that cycle and to stop it before it starts or to stop it before it gets out of hand. And one of the ways we can do that is to resist the urge to get back at our spouse. We have to choose to be the first one to show love and respect to our spouse, even if they don't deserve it. When you choose to do that, then you're moving away from the crazy cycle towards a healthier relationship. And believe me, I know this is more easily said than done. But something amazing happens when we choose love instead of revenge. God works through us when we choose love. Love inspires us to do our best, and God does the rest. The last tip I'm going to share today is to deal with one issue at a time. If there is a genuine disagreement or issue that needs to be worked out, focus on that issue first and don't bring other problems into the mix. This used to happen with my brothers and I when we got into disagreements when we were younger. And that's why I know that this advice applies to all relationships and not just marriage. But this would happen a lot with us. And you know, I confess, I would be the one to often bring other issues into the argument instead of focusing at the issue on hand. You know, my brother and I would get into an argument about who was on the Game Boy more or something like that. And then I would bring other issues into the argument and things like, well, you know, remember last week you had the last piece of cake? Or, you know, things like that. And we'd start arguing about that. And, you know, pretty soon we'd be arguing about something completely different than what the main issue was. And as brothers, we'd get stuck in this cycle too. So one issue at a time is very important. And let me add one last thing. Sometimes we just need to ask ourselves if the issue is really worth it in the first place. Is being right or having my way more important than being right with one another? This goes for any relationship. I think we often need to ask ourselves, is the cost of being right worth the damage that will be done to the relationship? We need to count the cost. You know, today you might have tuned in hoping for, you know, the secret sauce for relationships because you need a miracle in your marriage. And if that's you today, I want to pray for you. My hope is that today's talk helps us all understand some of the reasons we get caught in the crazy cycle of conflict and how we can catch this early and, you know, just to nip it in the bud before it gets out of control. When Jesus walked this earth, he experienced all the same struggles that we do. He knows that pain that you feel, and he knows it well. That feeling of being misunderstood. Jesus took upon himself all of my sin, all of my wrongdoings, and the guilt and the pain, and he took it upon himself on a cross because of his great love for you. And he defeated death, rose to life again, and is alive, and that is why we can live a life of purpose filled with grace and love. Maybe you spend more time on the crazy cycle than you would like to, and you would like to trade that cycle for a rewarding, joy-filled cycle of mutual, unconditional love and respect for one another. God cares about your marriage. You know why? Because He invented marriage. And it's a beautiful thing when a couple comes together, chooses to meet each other's needs regardless of how they might feel, and regardless of whether the other person deserves it or not. If you consider yourself to be a Christian, then you might already know that earlier in his letter to the Ephesians, Paul writes and he instructs husbands and wives to submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. What that means is this is no longer just about me and my spouse anymore. This is also about God. When we choose to give the unconditional love, the unconditional respect, even when it might not be deserved, we're doing it as if unto Jesus. It becomes more than just a way that I meet the needs of my spouse, but it becomes an act of worship and a way of showing honor to Jesus Christ. That is what marriage is all about, and that's why we need Jesus in our marriages, because our spouse will fall short. There will be times when they don't deserve the care, the love, the honor, the respect that they need. I'm reminded today that Jesus died for the whole world because He loves us. He didn't show His love for us because we deserve it or because we somehow earned it, because we didn't. He did it because He chose us despite our shortcomings. Because He wanted to have a relationship with us. And that is so much more wonderful than anything else in this world. And if you're not a Christian today, and maybe you just decided to tune in because you want to learn how you can have a happy marriage, I'm so glad that you're here. If this is your first time hearing about Jesus, or you've heard about Jesus before but have forgotten about Him, and you want to connect with Him again today, Jesus would love to have a relationship with you. So if you want to invite Jesus into your life today, would love for you to pray with me. So wherever you're at today, in your marriage, maybe wherever you're at with God and Jesus today, will you pray with me? Jesus, I ask that you would come into my life. I thank you that you chose me despite where I fall short. And despite all of the things the struggles that I face, that you have the best in mind for me. Jesus, we all need your help in our marriages and in our relationships. We want to have the kind of marriage where there's mutual understanding and love and respect. But Jesus, I need you to help me to be able to meet the needs of my spouse, even when I feel that they don't deserve it. Help me to meet the needs of my spouse unconditionally. In Jesus' name, amen.